Hi, my name is Mark Campbell. I work as a drug and alcohol counsellor at NUI Galway, and I'm going to talk today on cannabis, titled Everything You Want to Know About Cannabis. Topics I'm going to cover today are what it is, the effects of cannabis, what is dependence, the law, medical uses, prevalence of cannabis use, and the details of helping services. Start off with what cannabis is. Cannabis has many different names, slang names such as draw, blow, pot, weed, hash, wacky backy. There are different forms of cannabis. I'll go through each type, okay? First, they all come from the cannabis plant, which hemp comes from. One type of cannabis is hash, probably the most commonly known type of cannabis, and a word that people use to describe all types of cannabis. Hash comes from the resin from the buds of the cannabis plant. What happens is the resin from the buds is collected, it's dried and compressed into a block. It comes in a kind of a brown block form. That's one type of cannabis. The other type of cannabis is herbal cannabis. Now, herbal cannabis tends to be the chopped up cannabis plants, mainly the buds and leaves, but you can get kind of bits of stem and bits of twigs in it. It's chopped up, and that's a different form of cannabis. The other form of cannabis is weed or skunk. Now, I suppose weed or skunk is a kind of a particularly strong form of cannabis. It's grown, the cannabis plant for weed is generally grown by hydroponic means. That means rather than being grown in soil, it's grown in water and fed with nutrients. And what gives it its particular strength is that before the plants reach maturity, any male plants are removed. This prevents the female plants from detecting any pollen, so they produce even more sticky buds in an attempt to catch a speck of pollen and make some seeds. So I suppose weed is kind of, in a sense, artificially grown, but it's a particularly strong form of cannabis. It's generally 2.5 to 5 times the strength of resin. The other type of cannabis is cannabis oil, which is kind of a distilled form of cannabis. It comes as an actual oil, but it's very rare in this country. I mean, it's used by generally people would use a scrap paper and stick it in, and that's how it and burn it, and that's how it's used. Cannabis can be smoked in a joint. It can be cooked and eaten, often in what's known as hash brownies. Cannabis is depressant with hallucinogenic properties, in the sense that it slows down the central nervous system, but it also can produce a change in a person's sense of perception. I mean, some drugs like alcohol, for example, would be depressant. It slows down the central nervous system. LSD or acid would be an hallucinogen. It alters a person's perception of reality quite significantly, whereas cannabis is kind of a mix of the two. Whether it's the depressant qualities as opposed to the hallucinogenic properties depends on the actual strength of the cannabis. With hash, it's more of a depressant effect. With skunk, it might be more of an hallucinogenic effect. Maybe we'll talk about that in a bit. These are pictures of cannabis resin. As you can see, is a brown block. Herbal cannabis, chopped up parts of the cannabis plant. High strength cannabis, weed or skunk, quite distinct from herbal cannabis. It's kind of a different texture, and it's mainly, as I say, the buds from the cannabis plant. This is cannabis hemp and cannabis hemp seeds. What are the effects of cannabis? Cannabis produces mild euphoria, relaxation, talkative. People become talkative. They can become giggly. They have the munchies. Time can appear slower. You can see some of the examples in the illustration there. Munchies is a mad craving for food like chocolate. Paranoia. Some people, when they use cannabis, believe that people are talking about them, people are looking at them. This is particularly the case with inexperienced users, and if they're with people they don't know or people they don't trust, the feelings of paranoia are more likely. Generally, with experienced users, paranoia is less likely. I suppose with the stronger the grade of cannabis, the more likely paranoia, especially if somebody isn't an experienced cannabis user. Other things that can happen are uncontrollable fits of laughing for no apparent reason. People find things funny that people who aren't kind of stoned on cannabis can't understand the reason for them finding things funny. Another impact of using cannabis, maybe using too much cannabis or too powerful cannabis, people can feel kind of sick and vomit. It's sometimes known as pulling a whitey. The illustration there shows phases of cannabis. As it states there, the effects begin within a few minutes, they peak at 30 minutes, it lasts 2 hours, and 25 to 30% remains in the body after a week. You can see there the different kind of phases of cannabis, the different effects that affect over time of cannabis. The physical effects of cannabis: the heart rate decreases, it lowers blood pressure, respiration decreases, motor coordination is impaired. I suppose, as I said, cannabis is a depressant. It doesn't mean it depresses a person, but it depresses the central nervous system. It slows down the central nervous system. I suppose, cannabis, people who are using cannabis, it affects their ability maybe to drive, and I think, cannabis is a legal substance. If caught it's illegal to drive and under the influence of cannabis. Has these physical effects. The desired effects then of cannabis are a feeling of warmth, a feeling of drowsiness and contentment. People feel disinhibited, anxiety is reduced, sociability is increased closeness and camaraderie, thoughts become more imaginative and creative. So there are kind of positive, there can be positive effects of using cannabis, and that's the reason why people use cannabis, because of the pleasant feelings. Cannabis can also have undesired effects. Concentration can be poor, short-term memory can be affected. For example, if somebody's under the influence of cannabis, there's not a lot of point in studying because they'll probably forget what they've studied. It can lead to apathy and demotivation. There's also legal consequences. As I said before, it can lead to hallucinations and paranoia. In few individuals, it can lead to acute psychosis lasting a few hours to 7 days and induce a mental illness in those who are vulnerable. I suppose, it's kind of rare that long-term ongoing mental illness would be caused by cannabis use. For most people, those symptoms of mental illness will disappear quite shortly after they stop using cannabis. I suppose for a few who maybe where there's underlying mental health issues, it can exacerbate those symptoms. Other undesired effects are lung damage, wheezing, sputum production. It can affect male fertility, the number and mobility of sperm. Effects on female fertility are not known. It can lead to dependence, and abstinence can result in restlessness, agitation, insomnia, and lack of appetite. I'll talk about dependence now in a minute. Not many people would say that cannabis doesn't have a dependent or addiction properties, but we'll talk about that after this slide. I suppose to talk about dependency, there's kind of two forms of dependency: physical dependence, which is often measured by the physical disturbance created by the absence of the drug. I suppose one of my first experiences of encountering physical dependency would have been, I worked in a hostel for the homeless over in the UK, and a guy came in, booking him in, making him a cup of tea, and made him a cup of tea, and when he was holding the tea in his hand was shaking up and down. He was suffering physical withdrawal from alcohol. I suppose alcohol would have a physical dependence. Also, heroin would have a quite significant physical dependence, in the sense that people who are heroin users and coming off heroin will experience physical symptoms such as stomach cramps, shaking, and pains in their body because of the physical dependence on cannabis. If they haven't got it, they get a physical withdrawal. It's arguable whether other drugs such as cocaine, cannabis, cigarettes have a physical dependence, but I suppose with cannabis, there is an element of physical dependence, in the sense that a person might feel restless or agitated for a few days after stopping using cannabis. Just talk about psychological dependence, defined as an overriding compulsion to obtain and retain the drug, whatever the consequences. I suppose psychological dependence is that the person feels that they need the drug and they want to have the drug because they enjoy the the feelings and emotions attached to the drug. There isn't a physical withdrawal maybe associated with the drug, but there's a desire to achieve the feelings and emotions attached with using the drug. I suppose some of the symptoms of dependence of any drug would be the following: using more or for longer than you intended, a constant desire to use or trying to give up and failing, spending a lot of time trying to get supplies of the drug, a lot of time using and a lot of time recovering from using the drug, spending less time on important activities or giving them up altogether, needing more of the drug to get the same effect, unpleasant symptoms when you stop. I suppose some of these symptoms can be related to cannabis use. Cannabis users who I've met have described some of these symptoms of needing cannabis to get by on a day-to-day basis, struggling to get by in life without cannabis. Some of them describe using cannabis, when they use cannabis, their life is a bit like a fog, and when they stop using cannabis, they slowly come out of the fog. But it can be a difficult thing to actually stop and not be tempted to go back again, particularly if the kind of withdrawal symptoms of feeling moody for a few days afterwards, feeling agitated, not being able to sleep, persist, and those symptoms can be overcome by using cannabis. So there can be a temptation to use again a few days after stopping. Just I suppose this death by cannabis. Cannabis can't kill you, can't lead to death. There was a case, I think recently, where the coroner put down on the verdict of death that cannabis was a factor in the death of the individual. It was a case in Wales. In fact, I think the person concerned had a significant number of other drugs in their system, so it was more likely that cannabis was not really the major cause of death. I suppose that cannabis can result in people exhibiting irresponsible behaviour, but physically it's really very much unknown that cannabis can kill a person, no matter how much they smoke or ingest. Just to talk about the law and cannabis. In Ireland, possession of cannabis remains a criminal offence. The penalties can be quite strict. A person can be convicted for possession of cannabis and given a maximum fine of €635 for a first offence, and for a third or subsequent offence an unrestricted fine and or 3 years in prison. In Galway, the legal system is pretty harsh on cannabis users, and if somebody is caught in possession of cannabis, there is a real chance they will get a conviction. There may be just a fine, but it can be a criminal conviction which can affect their maybe career opportunities in the future. The penalties for supplying cannabis are potentially much harsher than for mere possession, higher fines and a longer prison sentence. Unrestricted fine, I think a prison sentence of potentially several years. The guards have the power to stop, search and detain if they have reason to suspect a person of being in possession of an illegal drug. So if the guards suspect you are, or a person is in possession of cannabis, they have the power on that basis to stop a person, search them and arrest them. It's not illegal to have cannabis in your bloodstream, though it is an offence to drive under the influence of cannabis. So if you've ingested cannabis and your blood is tested for cannabis, you can't be done for possession of cannabis. Say if you're driving a car, you could be done for driving under the influence. It's not illegal to possess cannabis seeds, but it is illegal to grow a cannabis plant. I have to say myself, I believe that was the case. Then somebody I was working with, the guards raided his house and seized some cannabis seeds and said to him he would be charged with possession of cannabis seeds. He was quite concerned about this. I suggested to him that he couldn't be convicted for possession of cannabis seeds. So I suppose to allay his doubts, I wrote to the kind of the Central Drug Guard unit in Dublin. Eventually got a response saying that it wasn't legal to possess cannabis seeds, so from the horse's mouth almost. Just to talk about cannabis medical users, There are synthetic compounds, including nabilone, which he used. Nabilone is a form of synthetic cannabis. Cannabis, I suppose its illegal form, is believed to relieve nausea from anti-cancer medications. In terms of multiple sclerosis, to reduce spasticity, it can act as an anticonvulsant, can lower eye pressure and glaucoma. I suppose these are kind of anecdotal stories that people have told about their use of cannabis. I can remember meeting a young girl who suffered from arthritis, and she said that cannabis gave her a significant amount of relief from cannabis. I suppose there are other medications that can relieve some of these conditions, but some people swear by cannabis as being the only thing that kind of works for them. Just to talk about the prevalence of drug use in Ireland and in Galway and in third level institutions. There was a survey conducted in 2002-2003 of 21 third level colleges. That was concern, and the figures concerning cannabis showed that 37% of third level students had used cannabis in the last 12 months, and 20% of third level students had used cannabis in the last 30 days. The figures are up there. Significantly more males than females having used cannabis in that period of time. Comparably, 8% of students had used cannabis or ecstasy in the last 12 months, and 5.8% of students had used cocaine in the last 12 months. You know, admittedly, these figures are 2002-2003. The figures may have changed in the meantime, but I think they might be fairly similar. I mean, 37% of students is a significant amount. Having said that, 16% of students had used cannabis 10 times or more in the past 12 months, and 6% of students had used cannabis more than 10 times in the last 30 days. I suppose, you know, to state really that regular cannabis use is not the norm amongst third level students. Whilst a significant number of third level students may have tried cannabis at some stage in their lives, it's a fairly smallish minority who use cannabis on a regular basis. I suppose my experience is that I've worked with a significant number of cannabis users whose cannabis use has been problematic. But I suppose the number wouldn't be huge in say NUI Galway. I suppose the people who use cannabis tend to use cannabis on a regular basis. Often say that everybody uses cannabis, or cannabis use is widespread. I'm not sure that is the reality, because I think the reality is that cannabis users tend to, I suppose, mix and socialise with other cannabis users, so that I suppose their perception of the use of cannabis may be a bit skewed, in the sense that, well, everybody they know maybe uses cannabis, or everybody they know uses a lot of cannabis. That's because very much that's the social circle that they're in. Just then to talk about help that is available. NUI Galway offers a free and confidential counselling service to all students, and have a specific drug and alcohol counsellor, which is myself. The details of the counselling service are available in front of you there. There's also been a recently set up cannabis website which gives information on cannabis, and such as some of the stuff I've talked about today, effects of cannabis use, but also a rate your cannabis questionnaire, so you can check out if you are using cannabis, whether or not it's kind of problematic. That's the details of kind of the services in NUI Galway, and there's also details of services in the Midwest or the Western Health Board area in Galway, Mayo and Roscommon. Details of phone numbers for counselling, advice and help. Details also of organisations such as Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. Okay, thank you very much.